consume juice and smoothies, but also consume a lot of cooked foods and foods that have great healing spices and herbs, and find wonderful ways to use plants as medicine.
I have slightly different view than Kris here, because I am a big believer in fasting is good for you, but I'm not saying heavy duty fast. What I wrote in my book was at least once a week, what you should do is you should have a good decent lunch in the middle of the day, and then have a super light dinner, which will be maybe a bowl of soup or something, which should be super light, maybe even a clear broth. And then next day morning, you can either skip a breakfast or have a very light juice for breakfast, and then be ready for lunch. So it's almost like 24 hours from this lunch to that lunch. You're fasting, you are giving a nice deep rest to your digestive function. You're digesting all these metabolic impurities, what we call it as ama, and actually it resets the whole weekly digestive mechanism. So I think it's a good thing. Fasting for a long time in all the religious cultures have been used as spiritual discipline to be close to yourself. The Sanskrit word for fasting is upavasa, to be close to yourself. In the absence of food, sometimes it simply makes us feel a little bit more connected to ourselves. It's a spiritual experience, and sometimes I encourage my patients to actually have that. So I think I use it quite a bit, but I'm not in favor of doing it for 7 days with only water or no water, those kind of fast. They are too adventurous, and you should stay away from those.
I think the important thing is always the conversation is what's best for you. So from an Ayurvedic perspective, obviously, it may depend on your dosha. If you're a Vata, you may not tolerate fasting for very long. Kaphas, we can use it a little bit more to reignite that Agni. So, and oftentimes it's the definition, right? So what does it mean to fast? So sometimes it can just be juices or smoothies for a day, and that's just lightening your digestion for a short while. And fasting overnight, there's studies that show that, letting yourself not eating through the night definitely helps. So, what's best for you? Did you have a comment, Dr. Fasting or?
Yeah, there's a great book called Ending the First Cause of Death, which is actually about something called autophagy, which is where your body resets and repairs and reheals. It sort of discharges all the old sort of waste from the cells, and it's a way for the body to kind of fight the aging process. And it's really through this process of, like you said, almost like a overnight fast. Even it can be from light dinner and then nothing till lunch the next day. That really helps to reset the system, and doing it once a week, I think is a great idea.
Great, thanks. That's
I like your kind of fasting.
I don't know why they call it fasting. They should call it slowing.
I like that.
Another thing which I encourage people to fast in between the meals, and that's a pretty big new thing, that from breakfast to lunch you should fast and observe and try not to eat something, which is a big way to fast also. But it's another way of training and disciplining your mind also, developing willpower, so that it's one way to stay away from many other wrong things.
I don't believe in willpower. I believe in fat. And then you don't need willpower.
All right, here's a question for Dr. Hyman. You spoke about C-sections and non-breastfeeding causing negative effects on your microbiome. Can you explain this a bit more and reasons why?
Yeah, so when you're in the womb, your gut is sterile. When you travel through the vaginal canal on your way out, you swallow vaginal fluids, which are full of bacteria. When you breastfeed, you're breastfeeding the skin, and there's bacteria on the skin. And so you colonize your gut flora, and you hopefully colonize with good bugs. When you are born by C-section or you don't breastfeed, you don't get that benefit. And these kids tend to have more allergies, more asthma, more immune issues, or even linked to more autism, more chronic disease of all sorts. Now, I mean, that's not to make women who've had C-sections feel bad, because sometimes you do need a C-section, but the fact that 30% of births in America are now C-sections is ridiculous. I mean, I think we have, when I was in medical school, it was like, I think 15 or 20%. Now it's 30%. And I think it's really unnecessary in most cases. There's the Friday afternoon C-sections, where they're sort of, oh, you're not progressing in labor, let me do your C-section. That's not good. So I think those are challenges that we face, but there's ways of remediating that through probiotics and many other sort of gut repair programs.
Thank you. So here's a question about fat. We need fat, yes. Please talk about butter, ghee, and other saturated fats. They are always omitted from good fat lists. I know a lot of people have questions about fats. Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to hear the Ayurvedic perspective, but I grew up in the era of medical school when fat was bad, believed in low-fat diets, recommended them to my patients, prescribed them for high cholesterol, prescribed them for weight loss, and it didn't really work that great. And then I, said, well, I just have good fats. And if you read some of my older books, I do talk about the dangers of saturated fat. And then I began sort of to continue to read the research and the literature and begin to look at, how did we come to know that saturated fat was bad? And what's the evidence that's based on? And how good is that evidence? And what is the full picture? And I began to realize that we made assumptions that were just really wrong. And that when you look at the literature, saturated fat in the absence of carbs and in the presence of omega-3 fats in your diet actually isn't bad. In fact, as I said, there's 72 studies that showed there was no link between saturated fat and heart disease. And there are many, many other supportive studies that show this. And interventional studies where they actually give people, like 70% fat and high doses of saturated fat, they actually, in the absence of refined carbs and sugar, their cholesterol goes down, their inflammation goes down, their weight goes down, their visceral fat goes down, their liver heals. In fact, the best way to heal a fatty liver, is not from actually coming from fat, it's coming from sugar, is to use medium-chain triglycerides, which is all saturated fat. So I think, my thinking has really changed on it, and I just finished literally writing my book. I handed it in last week, and it's called Eat Fat, Get Thin. And it's really reviewing the research in this whole field, and I really turned my thinking around. I still have a visceral reaction, like when I use butter, because I'm like, oh, this is bad, but no, then I tell myself it's not bad because it's actually okay. But as long as it's sort of grass-fed and it's organic, I think it's fine. Do I eat sticks of butter every day? Probably not. Do I think you can include it in your diet? Yeah. And coconut oil is saturated fat. It's 90% saturated fat, whereas butter is 60%. I mean, olive oil is 20% saturated fat, and yet we find that if you give people a liter of olive oil a week, they actually reduce their heart attack risk by over 30%. So I think the idea that all fat is bad is kind of wrong, and the idea that saturated fat is bad is actually turning out to be wrong. Like the Kativans in South Pacific, they had 40% of their diet as saturated fat from coconut oil, and they had no heart disease or obesity or diabetes. And I think we're gonna see the tide change on this. It's a tough one because the American Heart Association and the government's still pushing low saturated fat diets, but I think it's all shifting.
Well, I agree that fats are good and they don't make you fat. And from an Ayurvedic perspective, all the plant-based oils are excellent, so no doubt about it, whether it's coming from sesame seed, flax seed, variety of different nuts. So all those oils are actually excellent. Talking about dairy and butter and ghee, ghee is an excellent fat. The problem with where we are getting ghee nowadays and how we prepare butter, it's not the same thing. Means the milk, what we talked in Ayurveda 5,000 years ago, it's not the same white liquid what we're talking about today. It's all pasteurized, homogenized, the fats are separated, the butter is separate. So it's not the same process. When we look at the classical Ayurvedic understanding of free-roaming cows and they giving milk a little bit more lovingly, and you're preparing a fresh yogurt and you churn that yogurt and the butter floats on top, and that's what you prepare ghee from, is a complete different food that we're talking about. That's very healthy, that's very anti-inflammatory. So fats are good quality fats. Everybody should ingest. Ayurveda calls brain as a frozen ball of ghee. It is that much quantity of fat that you have in your brain cells as such. But respecting your body constitution is important. So for Vata people, they should be eating a little bit more good quality raw oils in their diet. Pitta people should pay attention to cooling fats like coconut oil, avocados. And Kapha people, they are a little bit more sensitive, so they should be eating small portions of oil, which are good for them, but again, they are a bit sensitive, and we should respect their inner metabolic function in responding to those foods.
Well, it's so fascinating to kind of listen to you because, as we're learning about genomics, and we're learning about personalized medicine, and we're learning about nutrigenomics, and we're understanding the genes that different people have, we're actually discovering that, some people are, Kapha and may have issues around fat, whereas people who are pitta may have different things. And so we don't call it that in genomics, but you can see the genes and how they create different responsiveness to fat or carbs or sugar, and it's just amazing to me that we're sort of mirroring this ancient tradition.
Absolutely, because the Ayurvedic science is the science of life. It does talk about the whole epigenetics in your environment, how these people respond to a given situation in life, and what changes happens to their quantum biology or quantum chemistry, and how they respond to everything else. That's the reason why all the diet don't work for everyone. So some people respond to paleo very well, some people respond to South Beach diet very well. So it's the difference in their metabolic function, their thinking, their activity, their behavior, and understanding and decoding your body type is one of the first steps to know yourself better and start paying attention to everything that you do and what it does to you. And once you start making those connections very well, then you would have some very clear set preventive rules which are very specific to each individual based upon your body type.
Are you dying to know what I think?
I am.
Just some smart folks right here. So I'm going to actually ask another question. I think that a little bit of butter or ghee, especially organic and grass-fed, that's one conversation. But the bigger conversation to me is the overconsumption of dairy. And one of the questions that I'm always curious about, and certainly I've heard different things as a cancer patient, I don't have a hormone-sensitive disease, but if somebody had a very hormone-sensitive disease, when we know that dairy includes, growth hormones and whatnot, is that something that somebody who has an advanced breast cancer, for example, may need to stay away from, or at least consume in moderation from the breast sources?
I completely agree. I mean, milk has over 60 different hormones, all of which are growth hormones designed to grow a calf into a cow, right? So I'm not a huge fan of dairy. And I think that the dairy we eat, as you say, is not the dairy we used to eat. It's not from heirloom cows who are grass-fed. It's not pasteurized, homogenized. And I think it's a very different substance. And I'm not a big fan of it for many, many reasons, which I've written about. I think that in terms of cancer, there is evidence that dairy increases cancer risk, prostate cancer, hormonal-dependent cancers, breast cancer. So I really encourage people to avoid dairy. However, ghee has pretty much got no dairy in it. It's just fat. So I don't know if it has the same impact. And I think the thing that drives sex hormones, which drive cancers, and drive insulin, which drive cancers, is sugar and carbs. So I'm much more worried about the bagel than the butter.
There was a recent study which came out where the girls' menstrual age is dropping down from 13 to 10 in this country. And their main diet is yogurt and milk and ice cream and cheese and hamburgers. And if that's where all these concentrated hormones are going into their system so early, that's why they are starting their menstrual cycle sometimes at 9 and 10 years of age.
Even organic cows, they milk when they're pregnant, and they're full of hormones. If all the cancer thing doesn't scare you, acne is a big cause of pimples.
I think like with so many foods, like with gluten, I think you mentioned, and as well for dairy, like my approach is just to really minimize some of those foods, because sometimes, again, it's not maybe the food that's bad, is how much we're consuming of that, So again, it was the question, like, if I put a little bit of milk in my chai or my tea, is that, going to cause cancer? So, moderation is always important, especially those foods that we're most concerned about.
That falls into your 20%, Kris?
Yes. Okay. I like that 80-20, yeah, because I think a lot of people get so stressed when they go to eat, and it can, when you're eating when you're stressed, that's a bad thing.
I mean, what's amazing to me is I see these people who've been living these horrible lifestyles for 30, 40, 50 years, and then they go on a detox or change their diet, and literally like in 10 days, 30 days, their bodies completely change. So even if you've been like abusing yourself forever, if you reset, so the body has an amazing reparative, regenerative capacity. So like every summer I go to Nantucket, and there's a place called the Juice Bar, but they don't really sell juice, they sell ice cream. So, and it's awesome. So, and I eat it, I don't worry about it. It's my 20%, Kris.
Great. This question was answered already. Thank you. Can you offer some starter tips to help reduce fatty liver? And as you mentioned, it's really the sugars that drive that whole
Yeah.
metabolism.
I mean,
and,
this
yeah.
is a massive epidemic. There's 70 to 90 million Americans with fatty liver. It's the most common disease, and it's mostly undiagnosed, and it's affecting little kids. I met a gastroenterologist, was a pediatric gastroenterologist at a obesity conference, a childhood obesity conference. I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because we're seeing 5-year-olds with fatty liver from drinking soda. We're seeing 15-year-olds who need liver transplants. This soon surpassing hepatitis as the #1 cause of liver transplant, and it's predominantly from drinking sugar-sweetened beverages and high fructose corn syrup, which drives fatty liver. And the cure is essentially eliminating anything that raises insulin and getting rid of sugar and refined carbs, and then eating a lot of fat. Actually, in the animal studies and other things, you see just tremendous reversal of fatty liver by feeding people coconut fat. In fact, they used to feed pigs in the 30s. They wanted to get them fat. They fed them coconut oil, but they all lost weight. So they started feeding them corn. And you know what foie gras is, right? Foie gras is like a duck liver that's fatty. And you know how they get them fatty? It's awful. They sort of put tubes down the duck's throat and they force feed them corn. So corn causes fatty liver, not fat.
I work closely with a South Asian Heart Center in the Bay Area, and we have a database of about 50,000 middle-aged Indians who are a part of that program. And it's an interesting fact to notice, all of these people are vegetarians who don't eat vegetables.
Yeah, they eat rice and roti
It's mostly grain-based diet,
and
mostly grain-based diet,
Yeah.
and the source of protein is usually coming from milk and yogurt and cheese. And so when we start taking away those simple starches and giving them the vegetables what they should, that starts going down, and
Yeah.
it starts shifting the whole functioning of the liver, and they start losing weight and reversing their heart disease and prediabetes very easily.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that brings up a question.
We've got to write an Indian 10-day detox diet. Because I have so many Indian patients, and it's tough. They have diabetes and.
Yeah, that would be great. And that brings up another question that I've had in my mind, so picking all of your brains as well. One of the questions, how important is protein to detoxification? And many alternative doctors suggest that the liver needs protein to aid in detox. I talked a little bit about that in my food talk, that I think we've overemphasized the amount of protein that we need. I don't know if there's any new information on the amount that we need. I think what we commonly read, and I'm always searching, and it's always this 55 grams and 45 grams, and I think that's way too high, but maybe you can comment. And vegetables have tons of protein, so let's not forget that.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if you're just doing juice, I think it's tricky because, and maybe, why you feel depleted or sick when you detox. And I think they call it a healing crisis, but I don't actually believe in that. And I think that if you understand the biochemistry and physiology of detoxification, not sort of the hip, cool, like we call I'm going to detox, but like the actual biochemistry of detox in the body, it requires amino acids, particularly what we call phase 2 detox. So in order to eliminate toxins, they're all regulated through these pathways in your liver that require amino acids like methylation and sulfation and glucuronidation and amino acid, conjugation with acetylation. These are all amino acid driven pathways. So if you're not getting enough amino acids, which come from protein, it's very hard to detoxify, and things can actually get stuck and actually become worse. So if you put things through the first phase, you can't get them to the second phase without the protein. You actually can increase the risk of damage and harm from detoxification. So I think it's necessary. It can be done through, vegetarian protein powders. It can be done through amino acid supplements. It can be done a lot of different ways, but I think it's really necessary.
Do you agree? Do you feel that the current recommendations are probably a little high for our needs?
Well, I think, the evidence shows, and this is really just around more muscle synthesis, but you can't actually use more than 30 grams of protein, the average person, at a particular meal. And there's evidence, that we need maybe between, 0.8 to 1.5 grams per kilo of protein. And I think it really depends on what you're doing. Like if you're super active and doing a lot of fitness stuff, you may need more. If you're doing less, you need less. If you're older, you may need more. There's interesting studies looking at aging and mortality where actually more protein as you get older helps to improve muscle synthesis and prevents the muscle breakdown that is sort of synonymous with aging.
Thanks. This one is regarding raw foods, and that's always a big question when we talk about Ayurveda as well. I wanted to hear your thoughts on raw food diets. Raw broccoli better, fiber nutrients, or cooked, steamed, sautéed? It was addressed to you, but I think we can all comment if we...
That was Chris's question.
But I'd like to hear everyone's comments
You know,
as well.
I think people get into all these crazy fad diets, and you know, I was on a panel with a couple of friends of mine. One was a vegan and one was paleo, and I was in the middle. I said, "Well, I'm a pegan. I'm a paleo vegan," and I wrote an article about it. It's gone everywhere, and I think it's just, you know, it's just as long as it's real food. Like most of the time, you don't have to worry if it's real clean food. It's organic, if it's sustainably grown and raised, whether it's, and I think there's just some basic simple principles that everybody agrees on. And I think, yeah, I mean, if you only eat alfalfa sprouts, you're going to get sick, you know. And I've seen people look horrible on raw food diets. Other people do well. And I think it depends on your genetics, your constitution, and a lot of different factors. So you have to find out what works for you. Some people say, they felt, great on vegan diets. Other people say, when I started eating meat, all my health problems went away. So you just have to listen to what actually works for people. And we're all so genetically diverse that it really is, as you were saying, listening to your body. The best doctor in the house is you. It's your own body. You should listen to that doctor.
I would say the exact same thing. I think it's important to have a variety of different vegetables cooked and prepared in a variety of different ways. When I was a raw foodist, for a period of time, I felt great, but about a year into it, I realized I was actually eating more sugar than I was prior to being a raw foodist, and I was eating so many nuts. There was just nuts and everything. And my digestion, and I eat a lot of nuts now, but not to that same level, my digestion was slowing down. So again, just going back to the variety, and as Dr. Hyman said, your body will tell you. Some of you may enjoy raw broccoli, and that will actually do well for your digestion. Others could get very bloated, very gassy, have a difficult time with the raw cruciferous vegetables. So you're your own experiment.
Well, I agree. So raw foods are good, healthy. They are filled with prana. They're more close to nature. And they do contain the right kind of agni that we talk about, the elemental agni in the food that helps our digestive fire to digest itself. But going back to the same basics, that it's not what is in the plate, how much you can handle it, that's important. So whether you are able to digest that, there's a lot of water content in those foods, whether it's going to dampen your digestive fire, it's going to make your metabolic function a bit more sluggish. So eating in the right proportions, maybe lightly steaming it, gently